Notice, this is the second part of a multi-part series of videos. You won't really know what the fuck is going on unless you watch part 1. Watch part 1 by clicking on your screen, okay? We good? We good. Alright, now where was I? Let's see here. War, no, Thalmor. Delphine, yeah, that's right. So Delphine tells us about the Blades, about how she was a Blade, and about how the dragons in Skyrim aren't just coming back or from some other location, but that they're actually coming back to life itself. The Dragonstone that we got for her is apparently a map which details the locations of many dragon burial sites, and a lot of the important ones. Apparently the Dragonstone also has some kind of numbered list of which dragon sites Alduin is going to be interested in reviving, because she happens to know exactly where he's going to be next. Maybe the tablet has some kind of like table of command that tells us who's the most powerful dragons, or maybe the dragons can only be revived in some sequence or pattern. I don't know, it hasn't really been explained yet, but I guess you can come up with a reason in your head. The thing I don't get is how Delphine happens to know exactly when Alduin is going to go to these burial grounds. It doesn't have like a clock, does it? Can they only be revived at a certain time? Is she clairvoyant? I mean, that would make sense. She was apparently pretty clairvoyant last time. You know, I don't even know. Who cares? We go out to Kynesgrove, which is this town around the new dragon burial site, and find Alduin casting a B-res on some other named dragon. Alduin insults us a bunch, brings his friend back to life, and flies away. Then we kill his friend in what is actually a really well-authored dragon fight. This dragon uses new telekinesis magic and long sweeping attacks, and his area is a nice and spacious crater, which he jumps at. Wait, what? What was that? Well, that's Calamite? This is Dark Souls. Oh shit. Okay, so we kill the new dragon, same old, and regroup with Delphine once more. Delphine suspects that the dragons returning have something to do with the Thalmor, which is some elvish government. There's some big issue between elves and humans. Basically, the Thalmor may as well just be Nazis as far as I know. They often outright say stuff like, "Don't you see? Elven supremacy is the truth!" And after doing a little reading on these guys, they're kind of assholes. In fact, elves in general in Elder Scrolls are kind of assholes. So we're just gonna call these guys the Asshole Faction. While we're on the topic, it'd probably be a pretty good opportunity to get Skyrim's factions out of the way now that we know who our major players are. Now, those of us who have played a lot of Bethesda games know that in the game preceding Skyrim had a pretty piss-poor example of how to implement a war into an open-world, choice-based RPG. That game, of course, being Fallout 3, which also featured a conflict between two factions, just like Skyrim. Thing is that Fallout 3's factions were terrible. They were one-dimensional, were led by people making an unending stream of poor decisions, and you couldn't even join one of them. So, at the very least, compared to that game, Skyrim's factions aren't all that bad. I don't think they're amazing by any means, but they are at the very least competently written. And after having read all of their backstories on Lokia, I feel like the only way to give each one, and the factions overall, a fair shake would be to give each one of the factions their own sub-segment of the video. So yeah, we're going for the fragmentational thing again. The first team who has lives invested in this fight is the Blue Team, also known as the Stormcloaks. The Stormcloaks are a congregation of passionate, angry rebel, Skyrim-born Nords who are tired of the Imperials treading on their land and enforcing their laws on the people of Skyrim, and also have a disdain for anybody who isn't a Nord, with elves being the receivers of most of their racial hatred. The short version of the Stormcloaks' history goes as follows. Ulfric Stormcloak was a military leader commanding an army of soldiers under the banner of the Empire before his rebellion. After the signing of the White Gold Concordat, which is a whole other business we'll get into later, Ulfric Stormcloak was in charge of retaking a city called Markarth from a group of tribals known as the Forsworn, who had invaded the area. Now, Ulfric and his army did succeed in taking back the city, but they did so under the agreement that once they had done so, the Empire would lift the ban on Talos worshipping that the White Gold Concordat had placed on the people of Skyrim, which is a big deal for the Nords because Talos is one of the most important figures in their culture, and in their religion, and their folklore, and all these other things. Basically, Talos is the Nords' big deitic figure. However, due to pressure from the Aldemari Dominion, which is the faction that owns the Thalmor and is made up of the elves, the Imperials took back their agreement with Ulfric, rounded him and all his buddies up, and imprisoned them. During his time in the Clink, Ulfric learned that his dad had died, and he is now the heir to the title as Jarl of Windhelm. Ulfric thought that his dad was a pretty worthy cause, and busted out of prison with a smuggled eulogy, and made his way to his home of Windhelm. Now mind you, this isn't what started the rebellion in full. That trophy goes to Ulfric Stormcloak's duel with High King Torg, which flipped the switch on many of the citizens of Skyrim. The Nord version of the story is that Ulfric did indeed kill King Torrig in a duel, and that this was just an example of honorary combat in the ancient ways of the Nord people. The Imperial version of the story is that Ulfric murdered Torrig with his voice to usurp him. I bring up this little tidbit because we'll talk about it in a little bit, don't worry. Now, after Ulfric defeated Torrig in a duel or murdered him or whatever you want to believe, he went back to Windhelm, and before he knew it, the rebellion was on. Between their hatred of the Thalmor, their hatred of the Imperials and their laws, and the general frustration about not being able to worship the religion they want to worship, a metric fuck-ton of Nords swore allegiance to Ulfric, and thus the Stormcloak Rebellion was born. The second team to partake in this Blood Bowl is the Red Team, also known as the Imperials or the Empire. The Imperials are a much larger organization in Skyrim, who believe that because Skyrim is an Imperial province, it must follow its laws and doctrines, even those put in place by the White Gold Concordat. And without getting into the entire history of the Empire, which is not only unnecessary but would take a fucking while, that's all we really need to know about them for now. That's their stakes in the conflict that matters. The final team, also known as, I guess, Gold Team, are the Thalmor, which is an extension of the Aldemari Dominion, which is the government of the Elves. The Elves seek to unite Tamriel, which is the whole continent that Skyrim is connected to, under one supreme single government, which of course they control. As far as the conflict in Skyrim goes, the Thalmor obviously have a vested interest in crushing the Rebellion and the Imperials, though obviously more so the Imperials because they want all of Tamriel, and the Empire kinda owns a lot of it. And they are responsible for the White Gold Concordat and the banning of Talos worship by extension. As far as the war goes, they don't really do much aside from some evil shit like interrogations and racism. It should be immediately evident that these factions are more well written than Bethesda's previous affair, simply because you have at least the slightest modicum of a reason to join either of your two choices, and because they aren't totally black and white, and also the fact that you can choose. Obviously the Imperials are partially in the right because Skyrim is a province of theirs, but they're also kinda in the wrong because of how they betrayed Ulfric and forced their laws on people who aren't totally connected with the Empire, and also, you know, kinda bend their knee to the Thalmor a little bit. And same for the Stormcloaks. They're in the right because of how their culture is being bullied out of them by the Empire, and they're also kinda wrong because of how rampantly racist they are to pretty much everybody. The Thalmor are more one-dimensional, but they aren't really a major faction in Skyrim, and sometimes there isn't anything totally wrong with having a clearly defined good or bad guy.
Trooper, what are you doing here? Get back to your guard post!
The only real issue I take is with the Stormcloaks and the aforementioned rampant racism. I'm glad that they have a major flaw, don't get me wrong, but I think that having them hate everyone who isn't a Nord doesn't really make much sense. As I understand it, their main beef with the Empire stepping on their homeland is about Talos worship being banned. There's obviously more to it than that, but that seems to be the thing that has manifested a lot of the Nord's main issues with the Empire. So why don't the Stormcloaks accept non-Nords? Are they all just unanimously agreed that Nords are the only ones allowed in? Why not accept anyone who's not an elf, Skyrim-born, and worships Talos? By only accepting Nords, they are hamstringing their ability to grow an army by quite a fucking lot, especially considering they're a small rebel force who should probably be looking for anything they can get. Maybe this is an intentional flaw with the Stormcloaks, but I haven't ever seen this brought up anywhere in-game or even out of game, so I doubt that. And I also find it just a little bit unbelievable about how the whole Stormcloaks, the whole thing, don't accept Bretons or Argonians or whoever. If I had been the guy on the Bethesda writing team charged with working on the Stormcloaks, I'd have changed their racism just a bit to make them seem less idiotic, and maybe slightly more of a valid choice for the player's allegiance. Keep them racist against Imperials and Elves, obviously, but any Talos-worshipping Bretons, Argonians, Orcs, and Redguards, I think they could be given the pass. This way you can have the racism, and make the Stormcloaks seem like an actual rebellion scrounging soldiers around wherever they can get them, and it would make the war seem at least a little bit more visually interesting by having it be more than just blonde dudes fighting brunette dudes. But like I said, the very act of them having a major flaw is a plus. Now, we're still on the topic of the war in Skyrim, and while I dealt with the major issues the questline has from a gameplay perspective, let's talk about the whole rest of the war. Or perhaps the whole rest of the lack of a war is a more accurate way to put it. Now, I can only speak for myself and the two friends I asked about this, plus the two people I asked on Twitter, but I cannot for the life of me find any instances of Stormcloaks and Imperials naturally fighting each other out in the world. I've played this game for 196 hours at the very moment of this recording, and I have never, not once, seen the armies fighting outside of either scripted sequences or something I set up myself. It seems I'm not the only one either, because a video search for Stormcloaks and Imperials fighting only brought up a bunch of people uploading videos of fights in which they set up. I even went as far as to sleuth around r/Skyrim and didn't find diddly shit. And I would have asked V too, but honestly I'm not in the mood for Todd posting. And to be completely honest, I doubt they would have found anything. Maybe you guys out there have found some instances of Stormcloaks and Imperials duking it out randomly in the world, but you're in the minority. This is a major flaw of Skyrim's war, because it makes what is supposed to be a huge event seem like something that's happening far off in the distance. It's a lot like how people normally deal with wars and events in other countries. Skyrim talks a lot about its war in NPC dialogue, but it never shows the war or its effects happening unless you start the questline, and even then it only shows what happens inside of the cities. The closest you get to actual wars happening out in the world are these patrols of Thalmor and Imperials carting prisoners around, which can be interrupted. Allow me to compare this to another game that features a big-ass war between two factions and was also made in Bethesda's engine, Fallout New Vegas. In Fallout New Vegas, not only do people talk about the war between the NCR and the Legion, but you actually see it unfold before your eyes, even if you don't touch the main quest line. New Vegas, in addition to just having a bunch of people talk about stuff, also features events that happened in the aftermath of other events caused by one of the factions, like the NCR camp at Camp Searchlight, or the interrogation of Silas the Centurion, but also features concurrent events that are happening right as the player steps into the world, like the two NCR hostage situations at Nelson and in the quest Anywhere I Wander. But also has instances of these factions, not to mention other factions, getting into small squad-sized fights around the wasteland. That's not to mention all of the small camps and major bases dotted around the wasteland, all of the things that happen in the main questline, or the fact that Fallout New Vegas features multiple other factions, one of which being a set of alternate endings for the game. Mind you, this is Fallout New Vegas, a game that was made in just a year and a half to Skyrim's 3 years, which is actually 5 years if you count the initial development stages. I seriously do not, for the life of me, understand why this is the case. It's not like placing some Stormcloaks and some Imperial Legionnaires on a road or near a camp or in the woods or something is difficult. Hell, I will do. Hold on. Yeah, see, I did. It took me 15 minutes. I shouldn't have to say this, but if you're gonna have a major war in your game, it's probably best to show it happening. Especially since this war is supposed to be happening in the very country the game takes place in. Treating it like it's some far-off conflict in some other country doesn't work because it isn't far away. It's in people's front yards. Luckily, however, this seems to be a point Bethesda has fixed in Fallout 4. I can at least remember that game having little fights brew in between its major players, so hopefully it's now a non-issue. Hopefully. However, to end out on a positive note, one last thing I actually really like about the war in Skyrim is the fact that it probably indirectly, or even accidentally, deals with misinformation. Now, I've never been to war, and would personally like to avoid it if I could, but I imagine that a big part of war, whether it be for the patriotic civilians, or for certain battles, or the motives of soldiers, or whatever, is misinformation. Having the Stormcloaks and Imperials fight each other, and not the Thalmor, all because the war has gotten so bogged down in nationalism and telephone-style obfuscation of the facts, is not only kind of funny when you think about it, but is a really cool extra facet to this already decently written conflict. I mean, if you sat down Ulfric and Tullius and told them that the elves did it all, you'd probably have a pretty hilarious dialogue sequence where they both realize that the fighting was kind of for naught. Alright, I think we've spent enough time dawdling over the war, so we can finally count that as a finished topic. Now let's return to the main quest. After we kill the dragon at Kyne's Grove, Delphine tells us he wants to dig up some dirt on the Thalmor, because apparently they might be involved with the whole dragon thing, because they benefit from dragons fucking up both the Empire and the Stormcloaks. Makes perfect sense, right? So to dig in on the Thalmor, we're going to crash a party they're having with a bunch of big names from around Skyrim. To do so, we need to contact one of Delphine's contacts, who's buddy-buddy with some of the Thalmor, and works in their embassy. That's right, I said embassy. They have an embassy, like an actual foreign government. Just saying, but as somebody who's played a lot of games with factions in it, it's kinda surprising. Actually, that brings up another point about Skyrim that I like, which is how it deals with politics. I already touched on how Balgruuf dealt with the initial dragon attacks by making reasonable, sensible decisions after consulting his cabinet of similarly intelligent people, but he's not the only one. Ulfric has a cabinet, Ulfric talks about the new ruler of Solitude giving up Skyrim to the elves, General Tullius has lieutenants, I think you get the point. There's a lot of competent political dialogue in this game, and if there are any instances of someone making a completely asinine decision that only succeeds because of plot armor, I haven't seen it yet. Which is a good thing, because Fallout 3, the game before Skyrim, was chock full of this, and it left me questioning how anyone became an authority figure when they had no idea how to make a sound decision. Okay, we've gone on more than enough tangents here, let's get on track. We infiltrate the Thalmor embassy in the disguise of a partygoer attending the festivities, create a diversion, and sneak through the rest of the embassy looking for any dirt we can find on the Thalmor and their dragon shenanigans. This mission would appear on the outside to have a heavy stealth focus, but it really doesn't. You can get through this with pure combat if you wish to, but the setup and level design are likely to make some people start sneaking around even if they aren't a sneaking character, which is at least enough to make this quest neat. The only thing I think is missing from this would be the ability to disguise yourself as a guard and sneak around, even if such functionality was restricted only to elves. Towards the end of this dungeon, we see a Thalmor Justiciar and his pet elf torturing some poor soul over information about an old man named Esbern. Looting the dossier in this room informs us that the Thalmor don't actually have anything to do with the dragons. Fair enough, I did not see that one coming. After we kill the torturers, we learn that this guy thinks that there's an old man named Esbern in Riften. After we free the guy, the elves figure us out and hold Delphine's contact hostage, saying that if we escape, they'll kill him. And this son of a bitch, honest to God, says I'm dead anyway and punches the guard in the face so we can escape. This hero here starts a melee combat and blocks the stairwell so the guards can't get by. And right before... Alright, let's move on. We escape back to Delphine after having stolen information from the embassy and inform her that the Thalmor are looking for a guy named Esbern, who, as it turns out, is a friend of hers, and one of the last remaining Blades. He's apparently hiding out somewhere among the slums of a town called Riften, and we're tasked with searching for him. While we're in the town of Riften, I think it's a perfect time to discuss one of the major talking points and frequently brought up supposed positives of Skyrim. Skyrim has rather often been applauded as a game that has a very alive world, meaning that the world seems to function in a way that makes it seem like the setting of the game is an actual living, breathing place with as much activity, randomness, and interaction as our real world. Observe once more.
Skyrim, this is the best game ever made. Shut up. Holy shit, this world is so fucking alive, it's crazy! Everything is dynamic and it all works. This is amazing. I don't even know how they did this. Bethesda is a company that knows exactly what the fuck they're doing. I have such wicked respect for these guys. Oblivion was...
Which is a statement I personally am not so sure about. First off, let me explain a few things about how Skyrim and pretty much all of Bethesda's RPGs, save for maybe Fallout 4, which I haven't cracked open yet, are made in terms of how NPCs interact. When an NPC in Skyrim or in Fallout 3/New Vegas is created, it is spawned with a very limited set of actions it can perform or react to. Unless something goes wrong, an NPC will be able to say a basic greeting line, attack or defend itself from hostile characters, run away from a hostile character if it has been allowed to do so, and stand around. Pretty much every other action you see an NPC in Skyrim or Fallout performing is something that a developer has added to a list of actions they can perform, whether this action is something only this character specifically is allowed to do, or is something that the developers plan on having multiple or many characters do. Every single one of these actions is called a package, and each package is something that is crafted by and implemented by a developer. They don't get randomly added to characters as long as the engine is working as intended. This means that the developers over at Bethesda have absolute 100% control of what packages go to what NPCs, which means that any NPCs doing something that they shouldn't do is guess whose fault? No, not the Jews. It's Bethesda's world designers. Come on, guys. Additionally, all NPCs in Bethesda games are created individually by a developer, even the ones that appear to be randomly generated in-game, like bandits, which are made from NPCs that are used as templates for certain levels of random generation, but are still 100% customizable by the developers. Now, what does this exactly have to do with Skyrim's living world? Well, a lot, considering this system determines how every NPC reacts to things around them that aren't scripted events. First off, let me say that it is very true that Skyrim has an inordinate amount of packages when compared to Bethesda's other games, both the ones preceding it and the ones succeeding it as far as I can tell. And it is true that some of these packages are put to good use, namely towards making the towns in Skyrim seem bustling with activity, often seen in marketplaces where buyers and sellers are talking about goods and advertising product. However, I wouldn't go as far as to say that Skyrim's world overall is a very living place, especially when it comes to how NPCs react to certain situations. Now once again, I have to give Bethesda credit. NPCs can react to a lot more situations in Skyrim than they can in any of their other games. But I have to ask what the point of many of these reactions is. For example, something as specific as dropping a piece of armor on the ground can elicit an NPC to approach the player and ask them if they can have the armor for themselves. But if, say, someone in a town gets attacked by wolves, the only response you're going to get is the NPCs fighting off the wolves, which is just the AI's normal reaction to any instance of fighting. Followed by, usually, a that's enough of that and nobody talking about it. You can walk right up to the person who got attacked and be met with their standard affair of 3 or 4 generic responses, and no one else seems to care about the event right after it ends. The closest to a meaningful interaction I got from the AI was a husband and child running into their house and saying, "Please leave me be," after their wife and, obviously, mother died. And mind you, that's only from those two. Everyone else in the town will walk up to the body of the woman, say, "What happened?" and then walk away. Like I said, a lot of work was put into making these incredibly specific interactions, but besides novelty, which is going to wear off quickly, what exactly does having an NPC pick up some armor I dropped add to the game? Wouldn't it have been better served to use the man-hours wasted on that to make more important reactions, like when dealing with death or corpses or theft or really anything? Does having an NPC talk to you about some silly thing you did actually make the world seem that much more immersive? I really don't think it does. I couldn't really care if an NPC has the capability to detect if I eat a cheese Danish or not. I'd rather the NPCs have a fleshed out system for dealing with major events and crimes, which in comparison to Fallout 3 have barely improved. Mind you, this isn't even bringing up the part where a lot of these small packages don't even function properly. Anyone who caught my Skyrim stream from about a month ago now might remember the time where a bandit whose camp I was in the process of attacking was the person who asked me if they could have a leather armor I looted off of their friend who I had just killed. And I've had multiple guards tell me how they detest two-handed weapons while wielding greatswords. Now you might say those are just bugs, but I have a feeling they aren't just bugs, they're oversights. Remember all that technical crap we went through about how NPC packages are set by the developer, who can make sure certain packages aren't a part of certain NPCs' routines? Yeah, that was important for a reason. It's because a lot of these pointless little things the NPCs can do were distributed to NPCs who shouldn't be able to do them, and not enough care was put into place to make sure the NPCs aren't saying or doing something that totally breaks the player's immersion, which was supposed to be the chief benefit of having these minuscule interactions in the first place. And again, that's not even mentioning all the repeated barks the NPCs go over, the most famous of which probably being the shittiest meme of all time, "But then I took an arrow in the knee," that everybody loathed from 2011 onwards. And of course all the other infinite numbers of examples, like "Take a look, I hear they're reforming the Dawn Guard." You get the point. It's also not just a matter of dialogue options that makes Skyrim's world feel unresponsive, it's how it treats the player's actions, or more accurately how it doesn't treat the player's actions with any kind of a meaningful response. Now this also needs a disclaimer because once again small things like stealing a blacksmith's supplies can trigger a response from them, like said blacksmith sending bounty hunters after the player, but larger, more important actions seem to be not very important to the people of Skyrim. You'd think being the Dragonborn, or being a Stormcloak, or Imperial, or a Necromancer, or a number of other things would carry some amount of social baggage with it, especially considering I'm supposed to be, the one and only Dragonborn, who's kind of currently in the process of saving the world. But apparently not. I have played Skyrim for 205 hours, plus some change from when I owned it on my Xbox as of the time of this recording. And not once can I recollect anyone doing anything about me being a Dragonborn, or wearing faction colors, or joining one of the factions, or killing a bunch of people in a different town, or doing a bunch of quests in different towns, like repairing the Gildergreen tree or becoming the Thane. Let me compare this to a small moment in Fallout 2, where what the player's wearing drastically changes how one of the game's major settlements deals with them approaching the town of Vault City. If the player approaches Vault City in their Vault suit, they'll be given a free day pass and counsel with the town's leaders because Vault City is trying to make contact with any other vaults from around California. If they're wearing anything else, they'll be treated as part of the common outside rabble and be forced to go and find something of value to bring to Vault City to get their day pass, and they won't be given any counsel with the town government. Just think about the attention to detail that has to go into even thinking of something like that. Now, fair enough, Fallout 2 isn't chock full of details of this caliber, but Skyrim isn't either. But the thing is, Fallout 2 also has just a bunch of people commenting about your guns and gear like Skyrim. But unlike Skyrim, it also has a world and even a UI that reacts to your decisions. For example, if you kill a child, you'll be ousted by almost every community in the game, and you'll even get a specialized title. Similar effects happen if you join the Slavers Guild. The town of Modoc can be damned to starvation if you don't bring a truce between them and the Slags, who will also die out if you fail to amend their relationship. If you marry or divorce your possible spouse, you'll get a different unique title, and if you purposefully blow up the Gecko power plant, you'll be banned from entering Vault City because you've contaminated their water supply and screwed up one of their power supplies. This is of course just a small sampling of a very deep set of examples, but hopefully you'll get the point. These small little details aren't in and of themselves a bad thing, mind you. It's almost impressive that some of these packages are in the game at all, but something like this should be added to support more important efforts to flesh out the world, not to replace them. The issue of the world's livingness only gets worse once you play the game enough and start to get the repeated dialogue lines, which makes the NPCs seem like robots. And gets even worse once you notice that a lot of these packages, especially the ones in the towns, will repeat upon themselves. These minor details are good for novelty, but they're not good for much else. It would have been better served to have actually used the time spent making all of these stupid little packages to make the world react in a realistic way. Here's just a couple of hypotheticals from the top of my head, completely unscripted for a few seconds. Let's think. After the first dragon attacks in Whiterun, you could have smaller towns trying to build up walls or hire guard forces to protect themselves. If you become a known member of the Thieves Guild, you could be banned from certain towns without having to sneak in. If you lead one of the guilds in Skyrim, maybe you should be unable from holding a monopoly on leadership positions in all of the other ones like you can now, or outright banned from joining any of the other guilds. And if you fix the guild green in Whiterun, maybe have any followers of Kinnereth look slightly more favorably upon you. Again, a small set of ideas, but having consequences like this should have been a priority when making Skyrim. At least if a living, breathing world was supposedly something the Bethesda team wanted to get out of Skyrim. Now, that tangent went on for longer than I had anticipated, but it unfortunately has not given me enough time to find this Esbern guy we're looking for. But it has given me enough time to find something more important. Love. Aww. That's right, Skyrim has romancing elements in it. However, they are such a massive afterthought, I'm not even sure why they're in the game. Basically, the extent of the romance in Skyrim is marriage. You can marry an NPC, a whole heap of NPCs in Skyrim, and you do so just by wearing a necklace, finding your preferred NPC, and asking them to marry you. That's actually it. Those are the only requirements. Once you're wed, you can choose to have your spouse live in your house with you, and once you're there, they'll run an off-screen store and occasionally give you some cut of the cash it earns. And, that's kind of it. You can get divorced, and if you miss your wedding day, your spouse gets angry with you, which is kind of funny, I guess. But yeah, it's crap. Okay, now to be totally fair, the marriage in Skyrim isn't a big part of the game, but after Honey Pop, I think I'm entitled and obligated to talk about bad romance in video games, okay? Okay? Then I kind of just wanted to bring this up. I have no idea why I did, I just wanted to, like in the back of my head, I really just wanted to bring up this point. I swear I'm not trying to add filler to the video. But yeah, overall this marriage thing is incredibly shallow, and is luckily something Bethesda seems to have fixed in Fallout 4, which is hopefully a fix they don't forget about. Alright, we've stalled enough, let's get back to the main quest. So, where's this Esbern guy? Well, he's in the slums of Riften. To get to Esbern, we, for some reason, have to look for a guy named Brynjolf, who we haven't quite met yet, but apparently Delphine knows him, so I guess we can trust him. He's one of the first people we're going to meet on our way into Riften, and he says that he won't give us any information on this Esbern guy unless we help him out. You can try to persuade or bribe him to give you the info, but if you fail, you're gonna have to do this little stealth chore thing he does. I don't personally get the point of this quest, but I guess it's neat enough that you can bypass it with speech, so it's not all that bad of a quest. I mean, it's certainly more layered than 90% of the other affair in Skyrim, but it kind of wastes your time. After you perform Brynjolf's little scam, he'll tell you that Esbern is hiding in the sewers of Riften, the Retway as they call it, which just so happens to be a dungeon. Yay. However, this one is actually a really enjoyable dungeon. This is the first dungeon I've gotten lost in since I started playing Skyrim, which is something that you honestly start to miss after 100 hours. But I'm also navigationally kinda stupid, so don't take my word for it. What you can take my word for is how fun the NPCs in this area are. For some reason, the Ratway is full of joke NPCs who all have their own unique barks that are all some kind of humorous statement or a joke. It's refreshing after being in dungeon after dungeon that's full of Drogar going And you know, speaking of Drogar, I think it's high time for another tangent! Oh, come on, don't be that way. This time, let's waste your time by talking about Skyrim's enemy variety. Now, personally, I have a bad feeling in my gut that Skyrim's list of bad guys may not be all that up to snuff, partially because I've already done all the research. But for the sake of the audience, let's do what we did for Fallout 4 and list out all of the enemies in Skyrim, and compare it to a few other games from around Skyrim's time. Note that we won't be counting alternate versions of a single enemy as a new entry. So, for example, polar bears and bears just count as one bear enemy, and all 800 versions of Drogar only count as one as well. Alright, let's start. We have bandits, forsworn, ghosts, warlocks, and or other associated mage bandit types, whatever you want to call them, afflicted, vampires, drogar, bears, chorus, wolves, sabercats, skeevers, mudcrabs, ice wraiths, horkers, werewolves, trolls, giants, mammoths, dragon priests, dwarven spheres, spiders, and golems, falmer, spiders, skeletons, hagravens, shades, spriggans, wisps, daedra, firestorm and ice atronachs, slaughterfish, I guess, and dragons, of course. Okay, now let's see here. That's, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 36 enemies if my count's not off. Not bad, Skyrim. At least it is for now while we omit all of the little details. Now let's peer into the list of enemies provided by another open-world dungeon-crawling action RPG from around Skyrim's time that features dragons as a major antagonist. Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma has Chimera, Garm, Wyrms, Wyverns, Ogres, Cyclopses, Cockatrice, Hydra, Griffins, Skeletons, Harpies, Gargoyles, Evil Eyes, Nameless Men, Phantoms, Dragons of various sorts, Saurians, Liches, Goblins, Golems, members of the Salvation, which is a cult, Drakes, Wolves, Zombies, Bandits, which includes various types of bandits like bandit mages, and that comes out to a total of 25 enemies after filtering out any enemies that have an at least sort of similar function to other enemies. Now you might be asking, Caption, you just said Skyrim has more enemies. What's the problem here? The problem here is that not all enemies are created equal, and this is very much a case of quantity over quality. Let me ask you, what's the difference between fighting a common drogar and a bandit in terms of strategy? They are both normal human enemies whose primary methods of threatening the player are either swing a sword at them or to shoot arrows. Which is also the same tactics that skeletons use, and also happens to be the same attacks Forsworn can employ. Which also happens to be what Dremora do. And is also what ghosts kill people with. Hell, vampires and afflicted are the same way if you take off their one extra spell in that, like, spit attack. And in the vampire's case, it's literally just a spell that makes your health bar go down, so it's not like you can prevent it or anything. And let's not forget the Falmer. I think you get the point. Skyrim's pool of enemies suffers from multiple problems having to do with repetition and a lack of different strategies among enemies that belong to the same category. Not only does Skyrim have like 4 reskin versions of many enemies due to the game's level scaling nature, but like we've already established, many enemies function in the same way regardless of being different enemy types. Different enemy types said with some air quotes, by the way. Oftentimes, the differences between enemies are either negligible or so minor that they don't even shake up how the player deals with the new enemy, or it doesn't even make enough of a difference to be noted in the first place. Let's go back to our example of Draugr and bandits. The difference between a level 1 bandit and a level 1 Draugr is that Draugr are immune to poison, and have a 50% resistance to frost magic, which is something many bandits can also have depending on which race they spawn as. That doesn't change how you deal with them, all it means is that you just may as well not apply your poisons. You're still just going to run up and hit it until it dies. Or of course die to it if your numbers aren't big enough. The AI itself is also unchanged. The Drogar and bandits both run up with their weapon and attack you and maybe block on occasion or do a strong attack. It's not like bandits make use of extra tools like bombs or something, or Drogar make use of the fact that they're dead to do anything special. Nothing of the sort. They're the same damn thing, just as they were with the Forsworn and all those other enemies we listed above, except for maybe vampires, because they occasionally bring something back to life to help them. Just for comparison's sake, let me compare a basic undead in Dragon's Dogma to just the fighter class bandits, mind yourself that there are 3 other classes of bandit who all have their own unique weapons and fighting styles, to each other. The basic zombies in Dragon's Dogma have 2 attacks. They can slap at the player, or whatever else, with their gross uncut nail things to deal physical damage, and have a grapple attack where they stun the target and bite them until they break themselves free. Multiple zombies can join in on the grapple and pile onto the damage that this attack does. Unlike bandits, zombies are most commonly found at night, and are especially immune to damage when they're getting up, and are especially vulnerable to fire, holy, and topor attacks since they shamble very slowly, and making them any slower may as well just stun them. 'Cause they're zombies. Sometimes they even outright crawl on the ground to get to the player. They try to swarm the player as well as they can. Their AI is a little bit mindless, 'cause they're zombies. Though oftentimes the only players they're going to be able to outswarm are people who are melee attackers, 'cause they're slow, like zombies. In comparison, bandit fighters are the tankiest of their kind, employing either a sword and board, sword and shield for those of you who don't know what that means, or a 2-handed weapon. Bandit fighters can have up to 7 different special attacks that they actually share with the player's pool if you're the warrior class, though they can't use them all at once, it's dependent on their equipment. They do, however, always spawn being able to use the Onslaught and Impale abilities, which allow them to, respectfully, perform the warrior's basic 3-attack combo, and perform a strong stabbing attack that can knock back small targets. And in addition to that, they may of course also spawn with another or multiple other special attacks from the remaining 5 leftover special moves that they can perform. Fighters also have a special charged up heavy attack that can devastate a target's health bar, sometimes outright one-shotting whatever they're aiming it at, but are easy to block or dodge. Bandits, unlike zombies, go about combat with some hesitation, mostly because if they all attacked in a huge swarm it'd probably be a little bit difficult to dodge or block properly, but the important part is that they're not slow, they don't just swarm the player as much, and they have totally different techniques to the zombies. And mind you, this is just the fighter bandit, there's 4 classes total. Bandit packs can spawn with fighters, warriors, striders, and mages, all of which have different tactics to one another. And that's not even bringing up the part about Skyrim's combat, where every single creature in the game does battle by running at each other and slapping their opponent with their weapon or spamming magic and arrows until something dies, which is just one of the deep-rooted flaws of the way this engine handles combat in Melee. And after all of this, there's the issue with visual variety. Of those 36 enemies, 9 of them are just humans, and if you count Drogar, it's 10, who are just humanoids. Now, that's only 27% of the roster. Problem is, those 9, especially Drogar, Bandits, and Forsworn, are the most commonly encountered enemies in Skyrim, rivaled by only maybe wolves. Meaning that most of the time you're probably going to see a lot of dudes in clothing instead of many of the fantastical monsters and automata that the artists have designed, which is, at the very least, a misuse of the opportunities presented by making a game in a fantasy world, and makes playing the game not only a visually dull experience, but a repetitive one as well, and mixing this with Skyrim's constant use of dungeons as a shortcut for more interesting content like they've been doing in the sewers as we speak, Skyrim starts to feel like it's a cycle of samey content the more you play it. After searching around the Ratway for a while, we locate Esbern, who keeps up with the dungeon's humorous nature.
This'll just take a moment. This one always sticks. There we go. Only a couple more. There we are. Come in. Make yourself at home.
And then goes on a bit of exposition about how it's foretold in some kind of prophecy that Alduin is going to destroy the world, that the only hope we have to stop him is the Dragonborn. We tell him we're Dragonborn, and he agrees with us to go and regroup with Delphine and start putting together a plan to stop the dragons. We get him to cart his way back to Delphine's place, and we have a little reunion between them, and they tell us that we're going to need to go to another abandoned ruined dungeon to find some kind of a wall of history that'll tell us what we need to know about Alduin to defeat him. We walk out into the town. Wait, what was that sound?